Alright, so here goes. Never thought I'd be sharing my life story like this, but I guess I need to get it out somewhere. I've been married to Kathy for 12 years. 12 years of what I thought was a solid, steady marriage. Sure, we had our ups and downs like anyone else, but nothing I thought would break us. I was wrong. It started on a random Tuesday evening. Kathy came home acting strange, not her usual self. She avoided eye contact, her voice shaky when she asked if we could talk. I thought maybe she'd been let go from her job or something. But then she said it, I've been seeing someone else. At first, I didn't even process it. It felt like someone had sucked all the air out of the room. My head started spinning. What are you talking about? I asked. Who? And that's when she dropped the second bomb, Bob. My best friend. Bob, who I'd known since college. Bob, who I trusted like a brother. We'd shared beers, jokes, and way too many memories to count. And he was the one sleeping with my wife. I don't even remember everything that happened next. There was yelling, mostly from me, some crying from Kathy, and a lot of her trying to explain how it just happened and that she didn't mean for it to go this far. But none of her excuses made it better. Every word out of her mouth felt like another stab in the back. I couldn't sleep that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment in my head, trying to figure out how I missed the signs. Turns out they'd been carrying on for months, sneaking around right under my nose. I felt like the biggest idiot in the world. The next morning I confronted Bob. I showed up at his house unannounced, and he had the nerve to act surprised. Man, I'm so sorry, he said, but he couldn't even look me in the eye. It didn't mean anything. Didn't mean anything? He wrecked my marriage and it didn't mean anything? I wanted to punch him right then and there, but I held back. Barely. I told him to stay out of my life forever and walked out, slamming the door behind me. Now, Kathy's pushing for a divorce, saying it's for the best and that she wants us to be civil about it. But how do you stay civil with someone who ripped your life apart? This is just the beginning of what's been a nightmare. I'll post more soon, but I needed to get this part off my chest. I don't know how I'm going to come out of this intact. The day after Kathy's confession, I woke up feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. You know that heavy, sick feeling in your stomach when something terrible happens, and you realize it wasn't just a bad dream? That's how I felt. Kathy had already left for work, which was a relief. I couldn't stand to look at her. But then I remembered, I had to tell someone. I needed backup, support, advice, something. So, I called my brother, Nate. He's always been my go-to when life gets rough. I told him everything. At first there was just silence on the other end of the line, and then he let out this low whistle. Man, I don't even know what to say, he finally said. Bob? Seriously? That guy was over at your house all the time. Yeah, I said, bitterness dripping from my voice. Apparently it wasn't just for football and beers. Nate was angry on my behalf and it felt good, honestly. I needed someone to be furious because I was too tired to keep the rage burning on my own. He told me to lawyer up and make sure Kathy didn't get everything in the divorce. It felt so weird hearing him talk about my marriage in past tense, but I knew he was right. This was the beginning of the end. Later that day, Kathy came home like nothing had happened. She walked in, dropped her purse on the counter and asked me how my day was. I just stared at her, dumbfounded. Are you serious right now? I asked. What? She said, like she didn't understand why I was upset. Kathy, you cheated on me. With Bob. You dropped a nuclear bomb on our lives and now you're asking me how my day was. She rolled her eyes. Rolled her eyes. We still have to live together for now, she said, like that was some kind of excuse. I don't want things to be tense. Too late for that, I snapped. That night I couldn't stay in the house. I grabbed my keys and drove aimlessly for hours. Ended up parking at this little diner I used to go to when I was younger. I sat in a booth by myself, drinking bad coffee and staring at the linoleum table. I felt so lost. Like my life wasn't even mine anymore. Then, as if my luck couldn't get any worse, Kathy texted me, Bob wants to talk to you. He feels terrible about everything. That was it. I slammed my phone on the table, paid for the coffee and drove straight to Bob's place. I didn't care if it was late or if I woke up his neighbors. I needed to see him face to face to understand why he'd betrayed me. When Bob opened the door, he looked like a deer in headlights. He stammered something about being sorry, but I cut him off. "How could you do this to me?" I shouted. "We've been friends for years. I trusted you." "I don't know, man," he said, running a hand through his hair. "It just happened. It just happened. That's all you've got." I stepped closer, and for a second I thought he was going to slam the door in my face. "You ruined my marriage, Bob. Was it worth it?" He didn't say anything. Just stood there like a coward. I wanted to hit him, but I didn't. Instead, I turned and walked away, my fists clenched so tight my nails dug into my palms. I didn't sleep at all that night. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, but why should I be the one to go? This was my house. My life. Kathy and Bob had taken enough from me already. That's when I decided, if they wanted a fight, I'd give them one. The next morning, I woke up with one thing on my mind. If Kathy wanted out of this marriage, she wasn't going to waltz away with half of everything I'd worked for. I'd poured my blood, sweat, and tears into building our life together, and I wasn't about to let her and Bob profit from stabbing me in the back. I started by calling a lawyer. I didn't know much about divorce proceedings, but I knew I needed someone who'd fight for me. The lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Marcy, didn't sugarcoat anything. She told me what to expect. Kathy would likely go after the house, some of my savings, maybe even spousal support. That last part made my blood boil. Why should I have to pay her a dime when she was the one who cheated? "You need to keep your emotions in check," Marcy said, her voice sharp but calm. "The law doesn't care about feelings. It cares about facts. Gather everything you can, financial records, emails, texts. We need proof if she tries to play dirty." When I got home, Kathy was sitting at the dining table, scrolling on her phone like nothing was wrong. It took everything in me not to lose it right there. Instead, I grabbed a box and started packing up her things, her books, her trinkets, even the stupid throw pillows she loved so much. "What are you doing?" she asked, finally looking up. "Making space," I said flatly. "You wanted out of this marriage, right? So start packing." She rolled her eyes again, like I was being dramatic. "You don't have to act like this. We can be adults about this." "Adults?" I snapped, slamming the box on the table. "You want to talk about being adults? Adults don't cheat on their spouses with their best friends, Kathy." She didn't say anything, just sat there with this look of mild annoyance, like I was the one inconveniencing her. Finally she sighed and said, "Fine. If you want to start dividing things, let's talk about the house." I laughed bitterly. "The house? You mean the one I paid for? Good luck with that." That night, I couldn't take being in the same space as her. I grabbed my laptop and started searching for places to stay. A buddy of mine, Mark, offered me his spare room for as long as I needed. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than being under the same roof as Kathy. I packed a bag and left without saying a word. Over the next few days, things got uglier. Kathy started making her own moves, filing paperwork and demanding her fair share of everything. Meanwhile, Bob was playing the victim, telling mutual friends that he never meant for this to happen, and that he still cared about me as a friend. Yeah, right. I started noticing little things too, like how Kathy and Bob were suddenly posting on social media again. Nothing outright romantic, but enough to make it clear they weren't exactly hiding. It was like they were daring me to react, flaunting their betrayal for the world to see. One night I was scrolling through my feed when I saw it. A picture of Kathy and Bob at some restaurant, smiling like they didn't have a care in the world. The caption read, "New beginnings." I snapped. My hands were shaking as I stared at the screen, my chest tight with anger. Without thinking, I grabbed my keys and drove to Bob's house. I didn't have a plan, I just needed to do something, anything, to let him know he couldn't keep getting away with this. When I got there, his car was parked in the driveway. It was this flashy sports car he'd always been so proud of, the kind of car that screamed midlife crisis. I grabbed a rock from his garden, my hands trembling as I weighed it in my palm. For a moment I hesitated. Was this really the kind of person I wanted to be? Then I thought about Kathy, about Bob, about the photo they'd posted like I didn't exist. And just like that, my hesitation disappeared. I hurled the rock as hard as I could, shattering the driver's side window. The sound of breaking glass was like a release, a small taste of justice. I didn't wait around to see if anyone heard. I just got in my car and drove off, my heart pounding. It wasn't my proudest moment, but for the first time in days I felt like I had taken some of my power back. Of course, I had no idea that this was only the beginning of what would become an all-out war. I barely slept that night. My adrenaline was still pumping from smashing Bob's car window, but the reality of what I'd done started sinking in as the hours dragged on. I kept asking myself if I'd gone too far, if I was just proving Kathy and Bob right by letting my anger control me. The next morning I got my answer. Around 8 a.m., there was a loud knock at Mark's door. I looked out the window and saw a police car parked out front. My stomach dropped. Mark opened the door and an officer asked for me by name. I stepped forward, trying to act calm even though my heart was racing. "What's this about?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "We've got a report of property damage," the officer said. "We need to ask you some questions." Bob had wasted no time pressing charges. Of course he hadn't. That's just who he was, a snake pretending to be the victim. I didn't deny what I'd done. There was no point. I admitted to breaking the window, and the officer told me I'd need to come down to the station. Mark offered to come with me, but I told him I'd handle it. I didn't want him getting dragged into my mess. The next few hours were a blur of paperwork, questions, and a lecture from the officer about how I needed to find healthier ways to deal with my anger. I was released later that day but left with a court date and the possibility of fines or worse, jail time. When I got back to Mark's, he handed me a beer and sat me down. "What the hell were you thinking?" he asked. "I wasn't," I admitted. I couldn't take it anymore. They're out there acting like they've done nothing wrong, and I'm the one whose life is falling apart." Mark shook his head. "I get it, man. I do. But you can't let them drag you down to their level. They're not worth it." Maybe he was right, but it didn't feel that way. It felt like Kathy and Bob had all the power and I was just some broken guy they left in the dust. Things got worse after that. Kathy found out about the arrest, of course, and used it as ammunition in the divorce. She told our mutual friends that I was unstable and that she'd feared for her safety. Never mind the fact that I hadn't laid a finger on her. It didn't matter. People love a good story, and Kathy was playing the victim perfectly. Meanwhile, Bob stayed out of sight, probably on the advice of his lawyer. But that didn't stop him from sending me a text. "You crossed a line. This isn't who you are, man. I hope you can find peace." Peace? Was he kidding me? I almost threw my phone across the room, but Mark stopped me. "Don't give him the satisfaction," he said. "He's trying to bait you." I tried to focus on rebuilding my life, but everywhere I turned, Kathy and Bob were there. People I thought were my friends started pulling away, buying into Kathy's sob story about how she'd fallen out of love and how I was making things difficult. The isolation was brutal. I felt like I was losing everything: my wife, my friends, my reputation. But if they thought I was just going to roll over and let them win, they were dead wrong. I wasn't done yet. After the arrest, I knew I had to play it smart. Smashing Bob's car window felt good in the moment, but now I was the one with a criminal charge hanging over my head. Kathy and Bob had already started spinning the narrative, painting me as this out-of-control ex-husband. I needed to find a way to take back some of the control they'd stolen. The first step was gathering evidence. Marcy, my lawyer, reminded me that the courts don't care about who's morally right, they care about facts. She told me to start documenting everything: texts, emails, social media posts, anything that showed Kathy's behavior during the marriage and the affair. That's when I remembered something. Bob and I used to share a cloud storage account. It was mainly for work stuff, shared files, projects, things like that, but occasionally we'd back up photos or messages there. I hadn't accessed it in years, but on a hunch, I decided to check if the account was still active. It was. And Bob, in all his brilliance, had left some personal files there. Among them were screenshots of texts between him and Kathy, photos of the two of them together, and even a few emails where they joked about sneaking around behind my back. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the evidence. It was like reliving the betrayal all over again, but this time I wasn't just angry, I was determined. This wasn't just fuel for my anger anymore. It was ammunition for the fight ahead. I forwarded everything to Marcy. She responded almost immediately, "This is solid. If she tries to push for more in the divorce, we'll use this." Armed with the evidence, I started laying my own groundwork. I reached out to a few mutual friends, the ones I knew hadn't completely bought into Kathy's version of events, and told them my side of the story. I didn't trash Kathy or Bob outright. I just explained what had happened calmly and factually. Slowly, a few people started coming around. It wasn't much, but it felt like a small victory. Meanwhile, Kathy wasn't letting up. She'd started pushing harder in the divorce negotiations, demanding half of everything, including the house. She even claimed she was entitled to spousal support because she'd put her career on hold to support mine. Never mind that she'd been working full-time the entire marriage. Marcy and I held firm. We countered her demands with the evidence I'd gathered, and it was like watching her hit a wall. Suddenly, her confidence started to crack. She stopped flaunting her relationship with Bob so publicly, and her tone in emails became less aggressive. But I wasn't done yet. I wanted Kathy and Bob to feel the same paranoia and unease they'd inflicted on me. I wasn't proud of it, but I hired a private investigator to keep tabs on them. Nothing illegal, just someone to follow them around and report back. It wasn't about revenge, okay, maybe a little. It was about leveling the playing field. It didn't take long for the investigator to deliver. Bob's reputation wasn't exactly spotless, and he had a habit of bending the rules in his business dealings. The investigator found evidence of some shady financial practices, nothing huge, but enough to cause him problems if it came to light. I didn't plan to use it right away. It was just nice knowing I had an ace up my sleeve if things escalated further. By the end of that week, I felt like I'd taken the first real steps toward getting my life back. Kathy and Bob thought they could walk all over me, but they underestimated just how much fight I had left. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. By the time I got the dirt on Bob's shady business practices, I felt like I was finally holding some cards in a game they thought I'd already lost. I wasn't looking to blackmail him. I didn't want to stoop that low, but just knowing I had leverage gave me a strange sense of relief. For the first time in weeks, I didn't feel like I was completely at their mercy. But Kathy and Bob weren't done pushing me. It started with Kathy's lawyer. She sent over a new demand. Not just half the house but also a larger share of my retirement savings. Her justification? Emotional distress from the divorce and the instability caused by my behavior, aka the rock-through-the-window incident. My lawyer, Marcy, was livid. "This is absurd," she said during one of our calls. "We have the evidence of the affair and she wants to talk about instability? Fine. Let's play hardball." We doubled down. Marcy filed motions to contest all of Kathy's demands, citing her infidelity and the texts I'd uncovered. I couldn't stop grinning when I heard the frustration in Kathy's voice during one of her calls. She didn't think I'd fight back this hard. But Bob. He was the wild card. One night, just as I was starting to feel like I could breathe again, Bob showed up at Mark's place. I was sitting on the couch watching TV when I heard a knock at the door. Mark opened it and there he was, Bob, standing there like he had something important to say. Mark didn't even let him in. "What do you want, Bob?" he asked, blocking the doorway. "I just want to talk to him," Bob said, glancing past Mark to where I was sitting. 2 minutes. "That's all I'm asking." I walked to the door, my arms crossed. "What do you want, Bob?" I said, my voice as cold as I could make it. He hesitated, looking down at his feet like some guilty kid. "I wanted to apologize. For everything. For Kathy. For what I did to you." I stared at him, trying to gauge if he was being sincere or just trying to clear his conscience. "You want to apologize?" I said, my voice rising. "You think saying sorry is going to fix this? You wrecked my marriage, Bob. You were my best friend and you destroyed my life. Why?" He didn't answer right away. He just stood there, looking like he wanted the ground to swallow him whole. Finally he said, "I don't know. I was jealous, okay? You had everything, your career, your marriage. I was in a bad place and I don't know. I made a mistake. A mistake. I snapped. You don't accidentally sleep with your best friend's wife, Bob. Mark stepped in, his voice firm. I think you've said enough. You should go. Bob started to protest, but Mark shut the door in his face. I just stood there, fuming. I wasn't ready to deal with Bob's apologies, or his excuses. The next day I got a call from the private investigator. He'd found something big. Apparently, Bob's shady dealings went deeper than we thought. There were whispers about tax fraud and some questionable transactions with a subcontractor. Nothing concrete yet, but enough to make things interesting. I told Marcy and she just laughed. Well, she said. Looks like your buddy Bob's skeletons are coming out of the closet. Let's see if he's ready for the fallout. That evening I got another surprise, a letter from Kathy. A handwritten one, delivered by courier. It was a bizarre mix of guilt, self-pity and deflection. She wrote about how she didn't mean to hurt me, how she was trying to find happiness, and how she hoped we could find peace. But the kicker was the last line, I hope one day you can forgive me. Forgive her? After everything she'd done? I crumpled the letter and threw it in the trash. Forgiveness wasn't even on my radar. Not yet. They thought they were untouchable, but things were starting to shift. The storm was just beginning. And I was ready to see it through. Kathy's letter lingered in my mind longer than I wanted to admit. For all my anger and resolve, her words nagged at me. I wasn't ready to forgive her, far from it, but I couldn't shake the part of me that had spent 12 years loving her, building a life with her. That part of me still wanted to understand why she'd thrown it all away. I decided to confront her, not through a letter or text but face to face. If nothing else, I needed to hear her explanation straight from her mouth. So I called her and asked to meet. She hesitated but agreed, suggesting we meet at a coffee shop we used to go to when we first started dating. I didn't know if it was nostalgia or manipulation, but I didn't care. I just wanted answers. When I walked in, she was already sitting at a table in the corner, stirring a cup of tea. She looked different, tired, maybe even a little nervous. Gone was the confident, composed Kathy I'd known. I sat down across from her, and for a moment neither of us said anything. Finally I broke the silence. Why? I asked, my voice steady but cold. Why, Bob? Why any of this? She sighed, staring into her tea like it held the answers. I don't know if I can explain it in a way that will make sense to you, she said softly. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been for a while. I leaned back, crossing my arms. So instead of talking to me, you decided to cheat? With my best friend. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't feel sorry for her. I didn't plan for it to happen, she said. It felt easy with Bob. Like he understood what I was going through. And what exactly were you going through, Kathy? I snapped. Because from where I'm standing, you had everything. A husband who loved you, a home, a stable life. What more did you need? She hesitated, wiping her eyes. I don't know, she said finally. I guess I felt invisible. Like you were so focused on your work, your goals, that you didn't see me anymore. And then Bob was there and he made me feel seen. Her words stung more than I expected. Invisible? Was she serious? I'd worked hard for us, for our future. I'd included her in everything, or so I thought. So, instead of telling me how you felt, you turned to Bob? The one person you knew I trusted more than anyone. She nodded, looking ashamed. I made a mistake. A terrible one. And I'm sorry. I laughed bitterly. Sorry doesn't fix this, Kathy. It doesn't undo the months you spent lying to me, sneaking around behind my back. She didn't argue. For the first time, Kathy looked like she truly understood the weight of what she'd done. I don't expect you to forgive me, she said. I wanted you to know that it wasn't about you. It was my failure. My weakness. Her words gave me no comfort. In fact, they made me angrier. I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I hope you find whatever it is you're looking for, Kathy. But don't expect me to feel sorry for you. I left her sitting there, tears streaming down her face, and walked out of the coffee shop. That night, I sat alone in Mark's spare room, replaying the conversation in my head. Her excuse, feeling invisible, didn't justify what she'd done, but it did make me think. Had I really been so caught up in my work that I'd missed the signs? Was there some truth in what she said, even if it didn't excuse her actions? I didn't want to admit it, but her words had planted a seed of doubt in my mind. Doubt about myself, about our marriage, about everything. But one thing was clear. No matter what Kathy's reasons were, she'd made her choice. And I had to live with the fallout. After my conversation with Kathy, I felt like I'd peeled back another layer of the betrayal, but instead of finding closure, all I uncovered were more questions and doubts. Every moment of our marriage felt tainted, every happy memory now under scrutiny. But as much as I wanted to drown in my own misery, I couldn't afford to. There was still a divorce to get through, and Kathy and Bob weren't making it easy. Kathy's lawyer was relentless. She pushed for more of my assets, claiming Kathy deserved compensation for the emotional hardship of our split. It was infuriating. Kathy and Bob had caused this mess, yet here she was, playing the victim in front of the courts. Meanwhile, I stuck to Marcy's advice. Keep my head down, play by the rules, and let the evidence do the talking. While Kathy's legal team kept me tied up in paperwork, Bob's presence lingered like a bad smell. I started running into him more often, at the gym, at the grocery store, even at a local bar I frequented. Each time he acted like nothing had happened, like we could go back to being civil. One night, after spotting him at the bar, I finally snapped. I walked up to him, my fists clenched. "Do you enjoy this?" I asked. "Parading around like you didn't destroy my life?" Bob had the nerve to act surprised. "Look man, I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I was wrong, okay? I've been trying to make things right. Make things right." I laughed bitterly. "How exactly are you doing that, Bob? By avoiding responsibility? By flaunting your relationship with Kathy while I pick up the pieces?" He shifted uncomfortably, glancing around the bar. "I'm not flaunting anything. We're trying to move on, just like you should." That was it. I stepped closer, my voice low but seething with anger. "You don't get to tell me how to move on, Bob. You lost that right when you decided sleeping with Kathy was worth more than our friendship." Bob raised his hands, trying to calm me down. "I get it, okay? You're hurt. But you can't keep holding on to this forever. It's not healthy." Healthy? The audacity of it was almost laughable. Before I could say something I'd regret, a bartender stepped in, warning us to keep things civil or leave. I walked out, shaking with anger. It wasn't just Bob's words that got to me, it was the way he acted, so unaffected, so above it all. Like he'd walked away from this mess unscathed. But he hadn't. Not entirely. A few days later, the private investigator called with more news. Bob's business dealings were even shadier than we'd thought. He wasn't just skimming money, he was defrauding clients, using false invoices, and pocketing the difference. If this went public, his reputation would be in shreds. "Do you want to use this?" the investigator asked. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to burn Bob's world to the ground the way he'd burned mine. But Marcy warned me to tread carefully. "If you try to use this as leverage in the divorce, it could backfire," she said. "We're better off focusing on the evidence we already have." So, I decided to hold on to the information for now. Bob didn't know I had it, and that gave me an edge. But I couldn't just sit back and wait for karma to do its job. I needed a distraction, something to take my mind off the divorce, the betrayal, and the endless anger bubbling inside me. That's when Mark suggested I join him at a local boxing gym. At first, I laughed it off. I wasn't exactly in peak physical shape, and the idea of stepping into a ring felt ridiculous. But Mark insisted. "Trust me," he said. "You've got a lot of anger to burn. This'll help." He wasn't wrong. The first time I landed a solid punch on a heavy bag, it felt like I could finally breathe again. Each hit was like letting go of a little piece of the pain, the frustration, the helplessness. For the first time in weeks, I started to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to rebuild. After that run-in with Bob at the bar, I decided to lay low for a while. The boxing gym became my escape. Every punch I threw at the bag felt like a small step toward reclaiming some part of myself that Kathy and Bob had taken. It wasn't a cure, but it helped. Meanwhile, Kathy seemed to be backing off in the divorce proceedings. Marcy told me her lawyer was suddenly more open to negotiation. Maybe Kathy realized she was losing ground, or maybe she was just tired of fighting. Either way, it was a relief. Then, out of the blue, I got a text from Ellen, a corrections officer I'd met through Mark. She was tough, no nonsense, and had this way of cutting through the chaos. "How's life in the trenches?" she asked. We ended up meeting for coffee, just as friends. She didn't pry, didn't pity me, she just listened. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could talk to someone without the weight of judgment or ulterior motives. It wasn't much, but it felt like the start of something steady. Meeting Ellen felt like a breath of fresh air. She didn't ask for details about Kathy or Bob, didn't try to fix me, she just talked. About her job, her hobbies, even this ridiculous story about a raccoon that had snuck into her yard and stolen her cat's food. For the first time in weeks, I found myself laughing. We started meeting regularly. Nothing romantic, it wasn't the right time for that, but it gave me something to look forward to. A reason to get out of Mark's house and feel normal again, even if just for an hour or two. Meanwhile, the divorce continued to drag on. Kathy's lawyer proposed a settlement. She'd keep her savings and car, and I'd keep the house and most of my assets. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than I'd expected. Marcy advised me to take it. Signing those papers was harder than I thought it'd be. It felt like closing a chapter one hadn't wanted to end. But as I handed them back to Marcy, I realized it was also a step toward starting something new. Small, shaky steps, but steps nonetheless. The day I signed the divorce papers felt strangely empty. I thought I'd feel relief, maybe even a small sense of victory after everything Kathy had put me through, but instead it felt like standing in a room I'd lived in for years and realizing it was no longer mine. Just walls and memories. Marcy assured me this was a good deal. Kathy wouldn't get her hands on the house, and I wouldn't have to fork over spousal support. Legally, I'd come out ahead. But emotionally, that was another story. After dropping the papers off at Marcy's office, I drove aimlessly for a while. I ended up at the park where Kathy and I had gone on one of our first dates. I sat on a bench, staring at the pond where we used to feed the ducks, and for the first time in weeks, I let myself feel the sadness. Not the anger, not the betrayal, just the loss. I stayed there until the sun started to set, and then my phone buzzed. It was Ellen checking in. "How'd it go today?" she asked. I hesitated before replying, "It's over. Signed the papers." Her response came quickly, "That's big. You okay?" Getting there, I texted back. She sent a thumbs up emoji, then added, "Boxing tomorrow?" My turn to get knocked around. I couldn't help but smile. Ellen had started coming to the gym with me, claiming she needed a new way to blow off steam. She wasn't lying about being tough, she could hold her own better than I'd expected. Her company made the sessions lighter, less about rage and more about growth. The next day we met at the gym. Ellen greeted me with her usual smirk, hands already wrapped for sparring. "All right, champ," she said, stepping into the ring. "Show me what you've got." We traded jabs for a while, the sound of gloves hitting pads filling the room. After a particularly strong hook from her, I staggered back and laughed. "Remind me not to make you mad," I said. She grinned, lowering her gloves. "That's the first time I've seen you smile in weeks." "You're welcome." It was a small moment, but it stuck with me. Ellen had this way of pulling me out of my head, of reminding me that life existed beyond Kathy and Bob. It wasn't romantic, not yet, but it was something solid to hold on to. Later that night, Mark and I sat on his porch with a couple of beers. He'd been a rock through all of this, letting me crash at his place and putting up with my mood swings. "So, you're free now," he said, taking a sip. "What's next?" I shrugged. "I don't know. I guess I start over." Mark nodded. "It's not a bad thing, you know. Starting over. You get to figure out what you actually want, who you want to be." It sounded simple when he said it, but it felt like staring up at a mountain I wasn't ready to climb. Still, I knew he was right. The worst was behind me, or at least that's what I told myself. That night, I sat down with a notebook and started jotting down ideas. Things I wanted to do. Places I wanted to go. Goals that had nothing to do with Kathy or the life we'd built together. It was hard at first, but by the time I went to bed I had a list of small, manageable steps. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but for the first time it felt like it was lifting. Slowly but surely. As the weeks rolled by, life began to settle into a strange new normal. The divorce papers were filed and finalized, and Kathy was officially out of my life, on paper at least. But the truth was, she wasn't gone completely. Her shadow lingered in the house we'd shared, in old photos I hadn't yet brought myself to throw away, and in the memories that crept up when I least expected them. One afternoon, I was cleaning out a closet when I came across a box of things Kathy had left behind. I hadn't touched it since she'd moved out, but something made me open it. Inside were little pieces of our life together. Postcards from trips we'd taken, a book she'd never finished reading, and an old Polaroid camera she'd loved. I held the camera in my hands, turning it over like it might give me answers. For a second I thought about throwing the whole box out, but then I hesitated. What was the point of hanging on to it? Nostalgia? Closure? Or was it just another way of torturing myself? Eventually I shoved the box into the corner of the closet and shut the door. I wasn't ready to deal with it, not yet. That night, Ellen called. She'd gotten into the habit of checking in, usually under the guise of asking if I was up for sparring at the gym. This time, though, she asked if I wanted to grab dinner. Something greasy and bad for you, she said. You need a cheat day. I agreed, and we met at a little diner not far from the gym. Ellen was already at a booth when I arrived, her hair tied back, looking as no-nonsense as ever. I ordered fries for the table, she said as I slid into the seat across from her. Figured you could use a break from kale or whatever sad salads you've been eating. I laughed. Sad salads? You think I'm that far gone? She smirked. Maybe. How's the mountain of emotions today? I shrugged. It's there. But smaller, I think. Or at least quieter. Good, she said, dipping a fry in ketchup. That's progress. Even if it's slow, it's still progress. Over dinner, we talked about everything except Kathy and Bob. It was refreshing, like stepping into a different life, one that wasn't defined by betrayal and anger. Ellen told me stories about her job, about the inmates she dealt with and the absurd situations she found herself in. I told her about the boxing gym, how I felt like I was finally channeling my energy into something productive. At one point she leaned back and said, "You know, I wasn't sure about you at first. Thought you might be one of those guys who stews in their own misery forever." "Gee, thanks," I said with mock offense. "But you're surprising me," she continued. "You're tougher than you look." Her words stayed with me as I drove home that night. Tougher than I looked? Maybe. But I didn't feel tough. I felt like someone who was just barely holding it together most days. Still, maybe that was enough for now. When I got back, I sat on the couch and stared at my list, the goals I'd written down after signing the divorce papers. It felt distant, like something written by someone else. But I knew I couldn't let it sit there untouched forever. I picked up a pen and crossed out one item, reach out to Kathy. It had been sitting there, a remnant of the part of me that still sought closure. But after everything, I realized I didn't need her answers anymore. I just needed to move forward, one step at a time. Just when I thought I'd found some rhythm in my new life, the past came knocking, literally. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I was cleaning up the yard when I heard the unmistakable hum of a car pulling into my driveway. I turned around to see Kathy stepping out, her face carefully neutral but her presence enough to send a wave of tension through me. I walked up to the edge of the driveway, arms crossed. "What are you doing here?" I asked, my tone colder than I intended. She hesitated, then held up a small box. "I came to drop this off. It's some of your things I found while packing." I didn't buy it for a second. Kathy wasn't the kind to go out of her way for something like this unless she had another reason. Still, I took the box without a word, glancing inside. A couple of old t-shirts, a random DVD, and my college sweatshirt, things I hadn't thought about in years. That couldn't wait for the mail, I said, raising an eyebrow. She shifted uncomfortably. "I thought it'd be better to do this in person." What's the real reason, Kathy? I pressed. You didn't drive all the way here just to bring me a sweatshirt. For a moment she looked like she might lie, but then she sighed. I wanted to see how you're doing. It's been weird not knowing. I laughed bitterly. Weird? That's what you're calling it. She looked away, clearly uncomfortable. I just wanted to make sure you were okay. I'm fine, I said firmly. You've done enough damage. There's nothing left for you to worry about. Her expression shifted, regret mixed with something else I couldn't quite place. I know I hurt you, she said softly. And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I needed to say it again, I'm sorry. For a second I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to yell, to tell her how empty her apologies felt after everything she'd done. But another part of me, one I wasn't proud of, just wanted her to leave. You've said it, I finally said. Now go. Kathy hesitated like she wanted to say more, but then she nodded and got back into her car. I stood there watching her drive away, feeling a mix of anger and relief. That night I opened the box again, sifting through the items Kathy had returned. Tucked at the bottom was a folded piece of paper. I almost didn't bother with it, but curiosity got the better of me. It was a note, written in Kathy's neat handwriting. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope you find happiness. You deserve it. I stared at the note for a long time, then crumpled it up and threw it in the trash. I wasn't ready to make peace with her, not yet, maybe not ever. Instead, I called Ellen. She picked up on the second ring. You're calling me during dinner, she said, amusement in her voice. This must be important. Kathy stopped by, I said bluntly. She dropped off some things and gave me another half-hearted apology. Ellen was quiet for a moment. How are you feeling? Angry, I admitted. And tired. Like, why can't she just leave me alone? Because people like that don't know how to, Ellen said simply. They always need to rewrite the story, make themselves feel better. Don't let her get to you. I won't, I said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it. Good, Ellen replied. Now, how about you stop thinking about her and meet me at the gym tomorrow? You can knock the crap out of something, and I'll even let you pretend it's her. I couldn't help but laugh. Deal. Hanging up, I felt a little lighter. Kathy might not ever fully disappear from my life, but with people like Ellen around, I was starting to believe I could keep moving forward, even when the past tried to pull me back. After Kathy's visit, I threw myself into distractions, boxing, work, even a weekend trip with Mark to clear my head. It helped, but only a little. Her unexpected reappearance stirred something I'd been trying to bury, that lingering sense of unfinished business. I didn't want to forgive her, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't fully closed the door on her either. A few days later, Bob reminded me just how much I hated that chapter of my life. He showed up at the boxing gym. Of all places. I was working through a combo on the bag when I saw him standing by the entrance, looking awkward and out of place in his polo shirt and loafers. I ignored him, hoping he'd get the hint and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he walked closer, waiting until I finished my set. Can we talk? He asked. I ripped off my gloves, barely holding back my frustration. What do you want now, Bob? He looked uncomfortable, like a kid caught doing something wrong. I need you to know that I'm leaving. For good. I got a job in another state. Great, I said flatly, grabbing my water bottle. You want me to throw you a going-away party? He winced but didn't leave. Look, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know I ruined everything. But I don't want to leave without saying I'm sorry. For all of it. I stared at him for a long moment. He looked sincere, but I'd seen that look before. It didn't matter anymore. His apologies couldn't undo what he'd done. Thanks for the update, I said coldly. Now, if you'll excuse me, I've got work to do. Bob nodded, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked out. I thought I'd feel victorious watching him leave, but instead I felt hollow. Like the fight I'd been carrying all this time had nowhere to go now that he was bowing out. Later, Ellen asked me how I was feeling after the encounter. Did it help seeing him like that? She asked. I shook my head. Not really. It just reminded me how much of my life I wasted on people who didn't care about me. "Hey," she said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "You didn't waste anything. You lived, you learned, and now you're here. That's what matters." I wanted to believe her, but I wasn't there yet. I still felt like I was standing in the wreckage, trying to figure out which pieces were worth saving. But as I left the gym that night, I realized one thing. Bob was leaving. Kathy was out of my life. For the first time in months, I could see the faint outline of a future that wasn't tied to either of them. It wasn't much, but it was a start. With Bob out of town and Kathy quiet for once, my life finally began to feel calm. The silence was strange at first, like standing in a house that used to echo with noise. But I started to appreciate it. No more confrontations, no more unexpected visits, no more feeling like I was constantly looking over my shoulder. I spent more time at the gym, pushing myself harder with each session. Ellen became my unofficial sparring partner, her sharp wit and no-nonsense attitude keeping me grounded. We'd grab dinner afterward, talking about everything from her job to the latest ridiculous news headlines. She never pried into my past, but every so often, she'd drop a comment that reminded me she understood more than I let on. "You're lighter these days," she said one night over burgers. "Lighter?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. She nodded, taking a sip of her soda. "Yeah. Less weighed down. Like you're starting to figure out what you want." I thought about that for a moment. She wasn't wrong. The anger I'd been carrying for months wasn't gone, but it didn't feel as heavy anymore. I'd stopped checking Kathy's social media, stopped wondering what Bob was doing, stopped replaying old conversations in my head. For the first time, I wasn't living in the past. The real turning point came one evening when I decided to tackle the box Kathy had left behind. It had been sitting in my closet, untouched since her visit, like a weight I hadn't wanted to deal with. But that night I pulled it out and opened it. Most of the items were meaningless: a book, an old pair of shoes, a half-used notebook. But at the bottom was something I hadn't expected: a photo album. I flipped through it cautiously, each page filled with memories from our marriage. Vacations, holidays, random snapshots of our life together. There was a time when I would have slammed it shut, unable to bear the reminder of what I'd lost. But now I found myself smiling at some of the pictures. It wasn't all bad, I realized. Kathy's betrayal didn't erase the good years we'd had. It didn't make the laughter or love we'd shared any less real. And maybe, just maybe, it was okay to acknowledge that. When I reached the end of the album, I closed it gently and set it aside. I didn't feel angry or sad, just at peace. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter than I had in months. I grabbed my notebook, the one where I'd written my goals, and flipped to the first blank page. At the top I wrote, "What's next?" For the first time, I wasn't asking the question out of desperation or fear. I was asking it with curiosity, with hope. It wasn't the end of my story, it was the beginning of something new.